It was in the spring that the young Dionysus came to the land of Thrace, came in the warmth and the burgeoning flowering of the land, as the green was emerging and the flowers were beginning to come into bud with a hint of the petals that one day would open. And in this land, Lycurgus was king. And he, Lycurgus, was a man no stranger to alcohol, but his chosen tipple was beer, as attested to by his sizable stomach and his pendulous moves. He was a lover of ales and beers, and when he heard tell that this strange man god, this child god even, had come into the land, teaching people to cultivate this wretched vine that grew and knotted and twisted and gave forth with grapes, and that these grapes could be crushed and trodden underfoot and fermented and brewed into liquid both blood red and crystal clear, each equally as intoxicating. Well, Lycurgus was disgusted. He was mortified. How could anyone drink such filth? And so, in a fit of indignation, he took against this child god, this boy god who had come into the land with his devoted throng of female followers. He found the place in the land of Thrace where the poetic god was residing, and stormed in with his armies, with his soldiers at his side, to drive them out of the land with spears and with arrows, with swords and with daggers, even as he saw the child being carried in the arms of the wet nurse Ambrosia, hurried away by her, cradled by her. Even he picked up not a sword or a spear, but an axe, and he hurled it with all the might of an aged warrior's arm. He hurled it till it thudded into the back of gentle, sweet Ambrosia, who toppled dead upon the sands of the shore, bleeding her last upon the pebbles and upon the sands. And as the infant wailed as he tumbled from his wet nurse's arms, so the Maenads, the priestesses in attendance, snatched up their child, and they called and they prayed to the gods of far Olympus, asking for aid, asking for protection for one of their own. And it was Thetis, queen of the ocean, at whose edge they stood, who heard and responded, and the waves parted, revealing half a mile out a cave on the floor of the ocean. And the Maenads, snatching up and cradling the infant Dionysus, they ran and they ran and they ran out through this passageway across the temporarily dried up bed of the ocean until they came to the cave. And the king's warriors raced after them at full tilt, but the women and the infant got to the cave first, and as soon as they were in the cave, great stone rolled over the front, and the waves came crashing down, drowning 100 of Lycurgus's men who had been in hot pursuit. But of the Maenads and the infant themselves, they were safe and secure in that sealed-off sea cave. They were safe, but Lycurgus was not, for he had gravely offended the god Dionysus by his attack upon the god himself, by his murder of the harmless wet nurse Ambrosia, who had never lifted hand to anyone in her life. And so, infant though he was, Dionysus stretched out his chubby little fingers and laid a curse upon the axe-wielding king, who, upon the shore, watching the corpses of his warriors being washed ashore, collapsed upon the sands, upon the pebbles. thrashing and twisting and turning like a man in the midst of a terrible nightmare, and as much as his warriors shook him, those that had not run out to see him drowned, shook him and tried to wake him, they could not. For 3 days and 3 nights he writhed and roiled constantly as a man in torment, until at length, at dawn on the 3rd day, he awoke, red-eyed, bloodshot, haggard-looking and terrible, a man riven with madness, twitching and snapping and snarling and muttering about, "The vines, the vines, the vines, they're coming, they're coming, they're coming." He looked about the palace, where he had been taken to reside in his bed under sheets of silk imported. He looked about him, he saw the posts of the bed. "There are vines growing up, there are vines. Fetch me a weapon, fetch me a weapon." And at once, of course, his servants ran to do as their king commanded. They brought a sword, and he hacked and he hacked and he hacked at the posts of the bed, screaming about, the vines that are growing up the bed, they're growing up the bed, get them down," as he stood upon the very bed itself, as if these invisible grapevines were about to besiege him and wrap him and knot him, until at length he had hacked down all 4 posts upon the bed. And his wife stood horrified in the corner of the room, surrounded by her maidservants, with her children, his very sons, besides them, watching though the madness that beset their father, calling out him, crying for the palace doctor to come and tend and try to cure this madness, begging for one of the priests or priestesses to come and exorcise whatever insanity had possessed the king. And like her, just hearing the cries of his wife, turned and clapped his eyes upon her, said, the vines, they are about you, they are about you." And discarding the sword, he snatched up an axe, which for some inexplicable reason was in the palace bedroom, and he set about hacking at the vines, which only he could see, which he felt sure were growing about the legs and torso and chest of his poor wife, who screamed and howled and collapsed dead, bleeding out her last upon the floor of the palace. And then, as his children, his sons, ran screaming in terror, as the servants ran screaming in terror from the maddened king, he screamed at them, the vines, the vines!" And one after another, servants and sons alike, he set about hacking vines that existed only in his own tormented, demented mind, hacking these vines from each one of them, until his sons lay dead, as his wife lay dead, until the servants of the palace lay dead, as his wife and his sons lay dead, until eventually, through sheer exhaustion, he dropped the axe and fell to the floor. And those few servants left alive and brave enough to come into the place took the axe away and placed it on a safe table, and took the king, Lycurgus, and confined him to a small room, where they felt sure his madness, should it set in again upon his awakening from this exhausted state, he would at least be unable to harm anyone else. Word went round the kingdom, as the viziers and the advisors of the court, the wise men and wise women of the land, fretted, what do you do with a king who has murdered his own wife, who has murdered his own children? Do you put them on trial? Do you execute them? Do you depose them? Do you pretend nothing has happened? What do you do? And whilst they were arguing this, the king himself awoke, confined to a room, and seemed to all outward intents and purposes calm, and said to one of the guardsmen upon the door, I am hungry and I am thirsty. Will you bring food and water? Because they refused to let him out, no matter how much he roared and commanded at first. And so at length the guard relented and sent for a servant, and the servant brought a plate of food and a goblet of drink, and carried it very gingerly into the room, watched over by the big birdy palace guard to make sure that the poor woman was not set upon by the king the way so many other servants had been set upon. And she placed the platter of food and drink upon a low table and scurried out of the room, which was promptly locked by the guard. Until they heard, some 20 minutes later, a terrible scream coming from within the room. The vines! The vines! And wrenching open the door, they saw the king with the knife that had accompanied his dinner, hacking and slashing and hacking and slashing at, well, who knows what. They couldn't see what he was hacking and slashing at, for the vines that grew up his legs, knotting and wrapping and twisting and turning around his body, trying to draw him down into the very earth itself, were vines that existed only in the delusions of his mind. And hack and slash at them as he might, for every one that fell off, another one grew up to replace it and replace it. And even as the palace guards tried to wrestle the king to the floor, tried to get the knife off of him, he had already done so much damage, hacking and slashing and ripping and tearing at himself, that he, like his sons, like his wife, like the palace servants, bled out his last, like poor Ambrosia, upon the earth, bled until there was nothing left to bleed. And the curse that had been placed by Dionysus upon the land of Thrace for their unwillingness to embrace the vine and for the murderousness of the king lifted. And from that day on, for a long time, Thrace was a land of joy, with a new king, a new royal family, and plenty of vineyards alongside the beer. Thank you.